Welcome to another edition, very special, of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains. And today, we're going to learn all about the beginning of the Superstition Mountain Museum from somebody who should know all about that, our own Larry Hedrick. Larry, I know that you started the museum with Tom Kollenborn. How did you meet?
I met Tom Kollenborn in 1975. He was teaching a class down at the Apache Junction High School called Prospecting the Superstitions. And I found it fascinating. I took two courses in a row. And although I had been here in the late 50s and knew about the legend from Hart Mullins and other people, Tom just so interested me in the mountains itself that, and at the end of the class, all the students rented horses and took a trip from Peralta Road, all past Weaver's Needle where we had lunch, and then out First Water Road. And I became friends with Tom. And over the years, if I said we made 30 trips in the mountains, that wouldn't be an exaggeration.
How did the idea of the museum come about?
Tom was a Rhodes Scholar. He also was a teacher at Apache Junction Unified School District. And he was involved in just about everything at Apache Junction you could name. He was on a lot of different boards and stuff like that. And somewhere around 1978, he began to talk about the need for a museum. He even showed me where his dad had talked about the need for a museum.
Here's a mystery of the superstitions for you, Larry. What on earth made you crazy enough, you guys, to think that you could start a museum?
One night we were over to his house just talking away, and he brought it up again, and I said, well, Tom, why don't we just do it?
All right, so now you decide with Tom that you're going to start a museum. So what hoops did you have to jump through to get it all together?
We had never done anything like that before, so what we did is we went and visited 3 museums in the Phoenix area and Mesa. The Arizona Historical Society, the Fire Museum, and Mesa Museum. And we talked to all their CEOs and other people about what they went through to acquire tax-exempt status and things of that nature. And we borrowed articles of incorporation. And we used their articles of incorporation to design ours. And we published it in the newspaper 3 times like you're supposed to do. And we paid for that kind of stuff out of our own pocket. And in 1980, we finally got our tax-exempt status. And Tom and I both knew that nobody was going to seriously help a fledgling organization that didn't have a thing, no building, no nothing, just a name. And for the purposes of incorporating, we had to have officers. And Tom felt like we shouldn't be the officers. We're just putting this together. So we named our wives as officers. And then, of course, after we got our status, we got our first board together. And we got Clay Wurst was the first president of the board. And Barry Grandell was an educator at Apache Junction. And one of my friends, Carol Prophet, was the other one. And that was our founding board. And we met at Clay Wurst's office, which he was a real estate dealer. Several other people came along at that point and began adding on. Greg Davis finally come on, a few other people like that. And then we started meeting, after we got about 10 people involved in the board, we started meeting at the high school. And when we got our tax-exempt status, Carol Prophet was an artist, and she was well known. She had works in many of the Scottsdale what do you call them? Galleries, Scottsdale galleries, and she knew a lot of people. And one day she called me up and she says, Larry, there's a fellow that's going to give a large donation of Indian artifacts to Brigham Young University. He's done that before. And I said, well, take me out and introduce me to him. And, we knew that, as I said, people were not going to give things to a fledgling organization. But I sat down at this guy's table for about an hour trying to convince him that we were worthy of receiving some of this stuff. And all I got out of him was, well, we'll see. Well, not very long after that, he went ahead and made the donation of the best stuff to Brigham Young. But he donated 400 pieces of Indian artifacts, pottery and stuff like that. Most of it was restored, but it was well done. And we put that in June Woods' garage, who was the person that was nominated during the articles of incorporation as the person of contact. And we stored a lot of stuff in her garage because she never parked her car in it. And I just wanted to give an example of how some things came about, because since we knew that people weren't going to help us right off the bat, we actively sought donations. We weren't thinking so much about money, but we wanted to get things to fill a museum. And Carol called me one night, and there was a fellow over in Paradise Valley that was selling his home, a rather fancy home with a 3-car garage, and he was moving up towards Sedona. And he was replacing all of the appliances in his house with all new stuff, so that for the sale of the home. And Carol knew that I had a flatbed trailer, and it was on a Sunday. She called me up and wanted me to go over and get this stuff that he was going to give to her. So I didn't want to go, but I finally gave in. We went over and loaded up all the stuff. And sitting in the corner off a ways was, in this empty 3-car garage, was a huge cabinet. And I was looking at the back of it, and it didn't look like much, but there was a space between the wall and the front of it, and I went around and looked at it. And it was an absolutely gorgeous display cabinet. And I walked over to the guy and I said, what's the story on that cabinet over there? He says, well, that was handcrafted in Chicago in 1890 and shipped to Barry Goldwater's father's first store in Prescott. And I said, gosh, I said, that's amazing. I suppose you're taking that with you. He says, well, I'd like to, but I've been thinking about donate it to a museum. I was back the next day with 7 guys, and we picked that thing up and loaded it on the trailer, and it's still in the museum to this day. It is one of the most amazing cabinets you ever saw. And this is how we got started. And another example is Carol called me up one day and said this fellow over in Scottsdale has a complete collection of Arizona highways he'd like to give to us. Well, that's good, but you know, no hurry. We put it off a week or so, and we went over and saw the guy, and he says, well, I gave those away already. He says, but I do have this fine collection of ore cars. And here he had 15 ore cars and stuff, and he donated to the museum on the spot. And we didn't have the boom truck at the time, so we sent Bob Shoes over, and he picked them all up, and all of our stuff ended up at the museum at Goldfield. Well, we'd done a lot of media in those days. We were on Good Morning America, West 57th Street, Unsolved Mysteries, all the TV channels in Phoenix and in Tucson, and some national headlines because I used the Calvary to promote the museum and everything that we did. And we were in President Reagan's inaugural parade. We were in George Bush's inaugural parade, and national television was focused on this Apache Junction group associated with the museum and stuff like that. And we began to get known through all this media that we did. And we began to get some offers. The first offer we had was, and I never could pronounce this quite right, was Tovera Castle.
Tovry.
Yeah, say
Tovry.
Tovry Castle. So we went down and looked at it, and the place was constructed out of solid cement, and all the electrical outlets were already there, and there wasn't anything you could do to add anything as you went up these flights of stairs, because each part of the castle got a little smaller as you went to the top. And we were really interested in that because of its location, and it was well known. But then they come up with the clincher. Says you guys are responsible for the care and maintenance of the building and the grounds. Well, now the grounds are huge and they're just covered with cactus, and you can imagine what kind of care that would take to keep the weeds out of this place on rainy monsoon season. And where would we get the volunteers to do all that? But because of several things, we decided to pass on it. And then we got an offer from Gold Canyon. Harold Christ had brought in a building from out of state, a long building. It's still out there. It's a church right now. But it was on blocks, and it needed plumbing and wiring and everything. We didn't feel like we could swing that. It's a good location. But we decided to pass on that. And then Ted Grazia went down to Tucson and offered his Superstition Mountain facility to us. And we went out and looked at it, and most of it was dirt floors, and you had to make about 15 turns to get to it. It was the hardest place to get to I ever saw, and it had very little parking. And we finally decided to pass on that. Well, then a big offer came. We got a call from Valley National Bank and wanted us to come down and talk to their president. So we went down, went on the top story and sat down in his office, and he says, we're building Superstition Springs Mall, and we'd like you boys to consider locating your museum at the mall. And he says, you won't have to pay any rent, or we'll provide the space and stuff like that. And he wanted some ideas. We gave him some ideas about the construction. In fact, it used to be our idea to go through some canyons to get to the entrance. And they had a model of the Dutchman's burrow and the Dutchman out there in a cave and all this sort of stuff. And he finally ended up saying, what would you boys have to do this? And Tom and I looked at each other, and Tom was speechless. He didn't know what to say. But knowing me, I just blurted it out. I said, well, sir, we'd like to have $1 million trust fund established at your bank where we don't get any of the principal, but we get the interest off of that. He says, well, that's not a problem. And we thought we had it made. So they wanted some of our stuff down there in the meantime. So in the entrance of the place, after they got it finished, I took the America's Mounted Military History, all the uniforms of all the different wars we were in, and made a big display. And on the other side of the thing, we had the animals of the superstitions and things like that. And we really had the feeling that we were going to have a home. Without getting into any detail, because there are still people alive, something happened to Valley National Bank. It's not here anymore. And that fell through. Then finally, we got with Bob Shoes out at Goldfield Ghost Town. And Bob offered to put us in a shell building, and we were to do the electrical and the sheetrock and the insulation and all that sort of stuff. And he needed lumber, so we made a deal when we went after the stamp mill in New Mexico that he got all the lumber and we got the mill. And the museum at Goldfield was built out of the lumber from the stamp mill in Bland, New Mexico.
So once you got it all together, when did the doors open to the museum?
We established the museum there and opened it in 1990. And we done an awful lot of work to the inside. I mean, it was a two-story building, and we had to sheetrock the upstairs and the downstairs. I had to build all the exhibits. And about the only help I had was a guy named Salvador Delgado. He came in, and finally I had somebody to hold up the other end of the sheetrock. And between us, we finally got it open, and we opened in January 1 of 1990. And then I was doing a story for the journal. We'd been doing journals for several years. By the way, it only took us 9 years to get into a museum. And a lot of those museums we talked to in Phoenix, some of them took 15 or 20 years to get in there, and they had some sugar daddies behind them. We didn't have any money coming our way at all. And I was doing a story on Weeks Ranch for our journal, which came out once a year. Weeks Ranch is located just across the street to the west of where the Superstition Mountain Museum is today, the new one. And in that research, I noticed that it mentioned patented land. And I said, well, that's private property. That whole area out there was all BLM and Forest Service land. There wasn't any private property in the area. And so I called Clay Wurst, real estate dealer, said, Clay, how would we find out what the status of this property is? And he said, well, why don't you call George Morkirky Realty in Phoenix? If anybody knows, George would know. So I called him, and I described the place to him. He said, oh, yeah. He says, that was listed with me many years ago. He says, it's in receivership with the Royal Bank of Canada. He says, would you like me to call them and find out what the situation is? So he calls back. He says, there's 160 acres of private property there, and you can have any or all of it for $10,000 an acre. Well, that seemed a little bit impossible, but he explained that the Royal Bank of Canada was paying taxes on unimproved property that was killing them over all these years, and they really wanted to get rid of this property. And so they made us quite a little offer. We were able to tie up pieces of it because it was separated by State Route 88 and a dirt road that went off to the south, Mountain View Road, I think it was called. So it was already in 3 pieces. You could only divide property back then into 3 pieces. But since it was divided by the road in 3 pieces already, each piece could be divided into 3 pieces. So Clay Wurst and I, he's also a surveyor and surveyed all of his own properties that he was dealing with. So I chained for him and run the aiming stakes, and we laid out the whole area and partitioned off the piece that we wanted and broke all of them down into 3 separate pieces and that kind of thing. And we put a sign up on the property across the road with the museum's phone number. So when we'd get a call, I would close the doors at the museum and go show property. And this is one of the greatest entrepreneurial associations I was ever involved in. We went from a fledgling organization in a rented facility with virtually penniest to $1 million corporation in no time at all. What happened was we first tied up the 57 acres where the museum is now, divided it into 3 pieces, and sold off this north piece and the south piece. The fellow that bought the north piece, we bought it we tied it up for $10,000 an acre. We sold it for $15,000. So the 16.5 acres to the north made us $80,000. And each piece that we sold thereafter, we paid the bank their $10,000, and we got our profit. And the final piece was 87.5 acres, which amounted to over $600,000. And when we got through selling all that land, the museum had a profit of $991,000, almost $1 million. Then we spent $220,000 to bring water in a 6-inch line over a mile to this property, which served everybody. Although they didn't pay for it, we paid for it. All they had to do was pay hookup charges. The man that paid $240,000 for the 16 acres to the north, immediately after water came in, sold it for $1.5 million. So now you can see that after all this effort, we had a paid-for piece of property, a building that was bought and paid for, and then, of course, we had the other buildings that we brought in. And that property today, based upon what the fellow at the north sold his for, $1.5 million for 16 acres, our 13 acres, ought to be worth a considerable sum of money today because it now has water. And that's the way the Historical Society got started, with Tom and I as co-founders, and this marvelous, wonderful opportunity of finding this property paid for everything. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, there you have it. One of the mysteries of the Superstition Mountains has been solved courtesy of our own Larry Hedrick, and that's the history behind the Superstition Mountain Museum. All right here on your favorite show, I'm sure, Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.